Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a special edition of the Data Intelligence webinar series by Caserta. This is actually our first live virtual panel that we're doing, and we're here to answer all of your questions about data and analytics and how it's affecting your businesses and how we can see the path forward through these times. So we have two excellent panelists with us today. We have Joe Caserta, who is our founding CEO. Joe is a best-selling author of the Data Warehouse ETL Toolkit, which is an industry standard. He's a thought leader and speaks at industry events. Well, he used to speak at industry events across the country. Hopefully he will again soon when we can all leave our homes. And until then, we'll have virtual events that Joe will share his opinions and beliefs and where we're going in the world of data analytics. We also have our principal data strategist on the line, Doug Laney. Doug is also a best-selling author of Infonomics, and he talks all about how to monetize, manage, and measure data as a real-world asset, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. So let's jump into it. So the first question is, the theme of today's panel is grafting DNA into your company's DNA. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what this means to you?
Joe, you want me to
go for it?
Kick it off? All right. So for me, kind of a clever little term there, I guess, but to put some rubber on the road, what it means to me is where an organization actually, we hear the term a lot about becoming data driven, and perhaps an overused term, but I think it still holds some weight. And it's about organizations actually using data and analytics to affect, if not drive, pretty much all aspects of their business. Now, in terms of making it part of a corporate DNA, there are a number of components. One of those is of course, change management. So we can deliver the best and fastest data warehouses and data lakes and analytic applications, but if the organization isn't prepared to take advantage of that data or that analytics, then really we haven't done a good job of grafting that into our corporate DNA. Often what this takes is a degree of data literacy. So while people are maybe comfortable with spreadsheets and basic bar charts and dashboards, truly understanding the range of data that's available in the organization, what it means, how to use it, different kinds of analytic techniques, the restrictions, increasing restrictions and compliance regulations related to data, all of that really needs to be something that the organization at large is educated on, and we kind of generally refer to that as data literacy. And then, as Remy, you mentioned, a lot of it's about going beyond just talking about information as a corporate asset and actually behaving as one. I mean, we know that data is not a balance sheet asset, but actually meets the criteria of one, and so becoming. We're getting an echo there, Remy. We're getting an echo there, Remy. So let's silence, folks. All right. Silence. Still getting an echo. All right, I think we're better now. So the idea there is to actually treat data as if it were like a balance sheet asset, and that takes all of this takes a tremendous amount of leadership.
Okay, I guess I'm up.
Yeah.
So so DNA, putting the, when we say DNA, right, data and analytics, DNA in your DNA, in your corporate DNA, I do think that it shouldn't be a concept, it should be a goal. I think that having data and analytics as just one more thing in your organization is not putting it in your DNA. I think feeling it in your veins and having it affect the way you run your day-to-day business, that's DNA in your DNA. And most companies are not there. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity. And I think, this horrific pandemic that we're all working through right now really, really brings it to light. And this idea, came while we're all sitting at home trying to communicate, trying to figure out, even in the basic business of Caserta, like what are our metrics, where are our our business metrics, how are our receivables, how's our sales. Like, you can't run a business without having metrics at your fingertips. And I think having data, it's funny watching the news in the past couple of weeks. I don't think I've heard the word data more on the news, that word data and the need for data, more than, the past 3 weeks, more than the past 10 years. It's so important nowadays. And especially when, what we're calling the invisible enemy, anything invisible, right? And most of the things that we measure are invisible. It's things that we need to figure out how to harness some kind of activity, put a measurement on it, and figure out if that measurement is good or bad. And that's the basics of analytics. And then figuring out, how do we affect that measurement? How do we make it get good if it's bad? How do we make it get better if it's good? And coming up with predictions on what different causes and effects will occur. I think having reactionary, after the fact reporting is helpful, but that's not data and analytics in your DNA. That is reporting, and that's nothing new. And that is not exactly working. Most of our clients, have no shortage of reports, sometimes tens of thousands of reports, and they still don't have what they need to run their business. And, and I think now taking a pause at any point in time is so healthy, just to get a state of the state and a reset. And, and when you do that, you realize, wait a minute, we're producing 10,000 reports a day. Nobody has the information they need. Let's try to reimagine what this should really look like instead of what it does look like. And what it really looks like is I should be able to answer any question of the business that comes to mind, and it should not be a project. And when we can do that, then we have DNA in our DNA. And hopefully within the next half hour, we could talk about some steps and some evidence on how that actually can occur. It's going to take a few different things. Doug touched a little bit on, it takes culture change, right? The tech part is actually, I hate to say the easy part, but it's probably one of the least challenging parts. It requires change in the way you do business, change in the way you think. And even if it's change for the better, every change means that you have to give something up. And giving something up is not easy, especially giving something up that you're familiar with and comfortable with. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about change management, disruption management, culture management, and then ultimately technology and data management. And Doug, if you want to add or even contradict what I say, would make it even more fun.
I just would emphasize, re-emphasize that the technical stuff, the data stuff, is probably a lot easier than the change management, especially for a lot of people in the IT world who are just not versed on change management and risk management and all that goes with it. So there's a lot that we as IT professionals can learn from folks in other parts of the organization who have that kind of change management experience, or even bringing in change management experts can help.
Yeah, and I do think that when you go from experiencing something to having it in your DNA, it is two very, very different approaches and two different ways of thinking about it. I know that any of the IT folks, anybody responsible for data right now on the phone, who on the webinars saying, wait a minute, what do you mean the data part's the easy part? I've been struggling for 20 years to just come up with a clean customer list, and we can't do it. Like, what part of that is easy? But comparatively to take a tens of thousands of people who are culturally used to doing something a certain way and asking them to all change and evolve around something that is new to everyone, I think that is a bigger ask. I also do think that the way we used to think about master data management and metadata and lineage and all of the things that we've been struggling for decades trying to resolve, I do think we need to start thinking about that differently. You know, I use the example when you Google, you know, the score of your favorite sports team right now. Are you interested in where it came from, how it got there, what technology was used? You know, was there a transformation? Was it originally a decimal, and was it rounded up or rounded down? Like, you know, all of these things that we kill ourselves over when we're building, like, you know, BI solutions. Once it's easy, once we could just ask a question in natural language and get an answer in natural language, and have some credibility, right, that it's not proven wrong, that becomes secondary. I think ease of use, being able to prove that it is the right answer, I think is important. And then being able to communicate with it. So being able to have a dialogue with your data, I think, is part of putting it in your DNA. Being able to get an answer and then asking a question based on that answer, another question to get another answer, and being able to cluster those questions and answers until you really get to what you need, and do it without ever reading a report, and maybe even without ever reading a dashboard. Just being able to have a dialogue. I know that personally, being home since March 10th, I've used my chatbot of choice more than I ever have. I've had it for probably 3 or 4 years, and I use it for everything now. And I think if I had the ability to be able to use it to get my business metrics, I wouldn't even need to open my laptop, right? I would just be able to do business all through voice. And I think that's where we should be going with our business applications and our business analytics.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. And before we jump into NLP and chatbots, first we'll segue into a question about culture. This person asks, what are the best practices for organizational transformation to build a data-driven culture?
You know, when thinking about that, the first thing that comes to mind is again back to leadership. And you know, few transformations are going to happen without effective leadership. Even if something boils up from a grassroots level, having that executive leadership and sponsorship to make it happen is important. So in thinking about data-related transformation, you're immediately, you know, thinking about the role of the chief data officer. And, you know, does your organization have a chief data officer, and is that chief data officer sufficiently empowered? You know, we see really two kinds of CDOs. One that is more consultative in nature, where they're providing guidance and strategy, but with no real, you know, authority. And then there are CDOs who are more of the peers of the rest of the executive team, the CFO, CIO, and so forth, really executing on the strategy, not just determining it. And so, you know, I think that kind of full flavored CDO role is one that is really necessary to affect organizational transformation when it comes to data and analytics. I would also add a few other, you know, concepts in here. One is back to measuring data. You know, we give a lot of lip service to data as an asset, and you know, there's the old adage, right, that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so, because most organizations don't measure their data, let alone even have a comprehensive catalog of what data they have, they're in a poor position to manage it with the same kind of discipline as their other assets. And you know, it follows that any kind of asset that you're not managing particularly well is one that you're not going to be able to monetize or generate value from. And so that it hinders transformation if you're not measuring that thing that's being used to affect the transformation. For a lot of companies, this becomes kind of a vicious cycle of not measuring and therefore not managing and therefore not monetizing or generating value from data sufficiently. And so our method at Caserta is kind of geared at reversing that curse or flipping the script a bit to create more of a virtuous cycle. Some of the things kind of more practically you're going to want to do to transform is doing what you can to eliminate data silos. Data is very easy to copy, and organizations need to get much more disciplined at only making copies of data when it's really economically feasible to do so. I mean, you're increasing, probably the hardest part in all of this back-end data management stuff is in managing all of the synchronizations necessary to move data from a source system into a data warehouse, into a data lake, into the cloud, and into data marts and so forth. And all that data movement and synchronization really, I think, hinders the ability to leverage data, to focus on leveraging the data better. So we need to think about creating data structures that are multi-purpose, are resilient, scalable, and so forth. I also think that moving towards self-service analytics is certainly a way to affect transformation. If you only have a few people in the organization who have the authority or ability to generate reports, and everybody else is just saddled with spreadsheet technology, it's going to be difficult to transform the organization at large. I'll also suggest that many companies, when it comes to data, are thinking strictly about creating reports from their data, generating often hindsight-oriented reports, and unless you're thinking really broadly about the variety of ways to generate value from data, whether that's baking it into existing products or services or extracting it from products and services, making data available to partners and suppliers and customers, or making the advanced analytics available to them, then you're going to, again, really have a hard time transforming. Also might throw in there the concept of data science organization to help you think more broadly and execute more broadly and deeply on the data that's available. Many companies are thinking very hard right now, given the current situation, about how they're going to digitize or digitalize existing products or services to make them available in a kind of a hands-off, distance-oriented fashion. And so, any organization that's not furiously thinking about that today, I think is going to not come out of this crisis in very good shape. A couple other things I'd mention just quickly. One is forward-looking analytics. Focusing more on predictive and prescriptive analytics, especially moving more toward driver-based modeling than trend-based modeling. The clients that we've talked to right now have broken data models, broken analytic models, because their forecasts are really only considering the historical trends within the organization, their sales and inventory levels and so forth. And unless you're actually out there looking at external data to get a sense of how the global economy is affecting your business, then your forecasts are going to continue to be broken. So I think those are some of the things that I think that might really help with transformation overall.
I would add that when it comes to culture specifically, right, that was the question, that we also have to consider that you can't manage what you can't measure, right? So how do you measure culture, right? That's a tough one, right? It's easy to measure sales. It's easy to measure operational throughput. How do you measure your culture? It's something that we actually tackled internally at Caserta. We came up with this thing called CDAM, which stands for Caserta Data and Analytics Maturity Model. And what we did is we broke it up into 8 different dimensions. One of those dimensions, and there are 8 different dimensions of analytics, data and analytics. And one of the dimensions, because it's so important, we have an entire dimension dedicated purely to culture. And coming up with ways to actually measure your culture. And some ways of measuring your culture at the very highest level is data and analytics part of your mission. Is it in your corporate mission statement? And if it's not, why not? And maybe it shouldn't be, and maybe it's okay. But if it should be and it's not, that's something to consider. Is our corporate data and analytics projects well funded? Are they? If they're not, why not? And if they should be, why aren't they? Do you have a chief data officer, someone at the executive level who's responsible for using your data? Do you consider at the core heart of your business to have data be considered an asset to your business? Mm-hmm. Or is it a backroom operation that's kind of a liability and expense just to store and maintain? And changing the perspective of data within your organization will affect the culture. Just speaking about it differently, changing the language, changing your point of view on, is data really an asset? And the best way to make data an asset is to get some value out of it, right? To ideate. If you're not already doing this, we have this bunch of data. We can do a couple of things with it. We can think about how to use it to drive new revenue streams that we've never done before, maybe productize it. Maybe we can just use it to measure what we're doing internally, operationally wise, and maybe reduce expenses and drive the bottom line up. And I think if we can start communicating internally the value of your data and how without it, just like the news today saying, without data we really can't manage this thing. Without data you can't manage your business. So really start focusing on it and change your internal communications to really start focusing on the value of data. And then if you change the focus of your internal communications, that's going to affect your culture, which is going to affect the people around your data, which may start to feel like your data is now in your DNA.
Yeah, quick indicator of an organization that might be having some cultural problems. Just today, I reviewed an organization's data warehouse and data modernization architecture, and in the entire deck, there was nothing about how they were going to use the data or what the requirements were for improved data access or analytics or anything like that. It was just strictly, we need to build this data warehouse and here are the features that it needs to have, but nothing that ties back to, why they're doing this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, years ago, Caserta was primarily a data engineering shop, right? We define success by coming up with some kind of technical metrics of having a project on time, on budget, being performant, and being able to measure that. Lately, our projects are tied specifically to business metrics, and I think those are the types of companies that are starting to put the data in their DNA, right? When a data project is only called successful if you can actually see it move the needle for the business, right?
All right, thank you. Which brings us to our next question. This is from a gentleman in the medical devices field, but it's applicable to everyone. Two-part question. Firstly, what should data analytics leaders consider as a priority when it comes to investments on information management platforms and capabilities in 2020 and beyond? And secondly, what would be the new and emerging roles that companies need to consider in addition to the chief data officer and chief digital officer roles?
You want to take the first part, Joe? I'll take the second.
Can you repeat the first part again?
Sure. What should data analytics leaders consider as a priority when it comes to investments in information management platforms and capabilities in 2020 and beyond?
Yeah, so this is what I think. I think that if I was on the hook to be the data guy in an organization, the first thing I would do is figure out how to stop every new idea surrounding data from being a multi-month project. I think that is killing companies. I think that you need to make a one-time investment, a substantial investment, and then trickling in subsequent investments. But I do think that the idea of going through what's essentially an inherited software development lifecycle process for data, right? Where you have to gather requirements, find data sources, do data profiling, write the data pipelines, do data modeling, build the applications. Like, to go through all of that every time you want to analyze a new piece of data, like, we have to, like, that has to be the #1 priority. Stop doing that. Stop doing that. I do believe, just like, when the end of the game happens, I can go and search for the score of that game instantaneously. And not only that, my typing the answer will happen before I finish asking the question. I think corporate America needs to have that internally. I think we need to start adopting processes like data robots, data spiders. We need to be able to crawl within our environment, find new data as it's created, and be able to bring it in, unify it, 100% automated, using machine learning and artificial intelligence and then be able to access it through natural language in milliseconds. Like, the whole process, end to end, should be milliseconds. Maybe a few seconds, right? But it should not be multiple months. We have to get away from that. And I do think that technologies, and we're not here to push products, but technologies are advancing to get to that. And I think 2020 is the year for that to happen. And I think not being able to communicate in person and sit in meetings, I don't know about everybody else, but bandwidth is, personal bandwidth, human bandwidth, is at an all-time stretch right now, right? There's only so many of these sessions that you can do, right? It's like meeting. I never get out of this chair, right? It's crazy. And the only way to really to optimize that is through data. The idea of asking people what they think, there's just not enough time anymore. I think we need to have the data tell us what it thinks, and we need to build that. We need to build machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence processes, data spiders to get the data. We need to systematically be able to clean, conform, consolidate the data so that we can have data as a service throughout the entire organization, regardless of who you are. And depending on who you are, it should not be a mystery whether you have access it. You have to go get access granted. You have to go through a process of filling out forms. Like, we have to stop all of that. Like, all of the legacy thinking towards modern data engineering, the legacy thinking has to now, that's the next leapfrog as a data leader. We need to take all of that legacy thinking, leapfrog it ahead of the modern data engineering that we have at our fingertips, and actually start using it the way the technologies are built to support.
All right. I guess I'll address the roles then. Boy, there are numerous roles that we see in organizations that are new and different and emerging. Unfortunately, most companies have the same kinds of basic roles that they did, even going back to the 1990s when it comes to data management and analytics. Yeah, we've seen the role of the data scientist emerge, and for the refinement of the data integrator role, as a data engineer. We've seen the emergence of AI and machine learning expertise, or let's call it the resurgence of those kinds of roles. But really, we're not seeing organizations organize themselves around data as an asset. And one of the first, I think, primary, and they talk about data scientists being this, the sexiest role of the 21st century, but there might be one that's not quite as sexy, but almost as necessary. Today, organizations just can't continue to stare at their own navels when it comes to the data that's available. And so we've seen a number of times where organizations have a data curator or a data librarian or something of that nature. And that individual is responsible for identifying external data assets that might be valuable to the organization. There are a billion plus, almost a trillion websites that can be harvested. There's 10 million open data sources published by government organizations. There's thousands of data brokers. Your company has probably hundreds or thousands of partners for which you could trade data for. So having somebody whose purview is on those external data sources and managing them on behalf of the organization so that you're not buying or licensing duplicate data is really important. Even internally, we've seen some of the data curators also focus on being the kind of the go-to person to call when you're looking for data somewhere in the organization if you don't have a data catalog. I'd also suggest that the role of the data steward ought to be expanded to include this concept of data advocacy, where they're not only responsible for kind of defining policies and procedures, but also in improving and encouraging the usage of data more broadly throughout the organization. We're, in addition to data governance, we recommend the role of analytic governance as well to manage all of the analytic models and algorithms that organizations are developing, ensure that they're reused and appropriate and maintained. This might be part of an overall analytics center of excellence. When it comes to understanding the value of data and building business use cases for analytics, somebody like a data economist or whatever you want to call it would be a great role to have. And on the flip side, ensuring that you're using data appropriately when it comes to the reputational issues of the organization. We've seen the emergence of digital or data ethicists at organizations. Maybe not necessarily a full-time role, but somebody whose role it is to think, kind of be the red team, and think about, here are all the ways that, all the bad things that could happen if we execute on this particular data-related initiative. From a legal standpoint, organizations already have legal counsels, but what we find is that very rarely are they well-versed in things like privacy and regulations and data rights and sovereignty and data exchange language. If you're sharing data with partners or suppliers, what kind of protections need to be in the contracts? So building up that kind of expertise is really important. Also, as we think more about monetizing data and generating broader ways to leverage data assets and even generate revenue from them, having somebody who is in a data product role is important. And I think I'll leave it at that. That's probably enough to chew on for now. It's a good half dozen or more kind of key roles. I've written in the past about 30 or so kind of emerging roles that we see in the industry.
There's one more role that I want to mention. I think that's worth talking about. Traditionally we would have data folks who are in databases or data lakes and managing access to data that way, and then you'd have BI folks who are writing reports. And most enterprises wanted to have a single way to do that, right? I want to have a BI tool. I don't want to have 10 BI tools. I want to be able to control all of my user access at the database level or at the BI level. And I think that old thinking needs to stop. And I think what's happening now instead is I do think the data as a service metaphor needs to happen. And the way that happens is no one directly accesses data, period. And no one has the authoritarian control to say, this is the tool you have to use to access your data. It's an impossible governance attempt that just can't be fulfilled. I've never seen it successful, ever. I think the only way to do it is to, one, have speed to value, where you can actually serve up your data very quickly, and accept that you have no idea how people can access your data. The only way to control it is through APIs. So either having a microservice layer or having an API layer, and having a role dedicated to that, and that role is responsible for performance of the data access, the security of the data access, both internally and externally, and also compatibility with all the application and downstream users and upstream data repositories. And I think it's a very, very important role, which may be more than one person, could be an organization in some big companies, because at the end of the day, reports are not going to be in our future, right? Applications reading our data insights is our future. And the best way for applications to speak to data is through an API. And also, I think the thought of having to copy all of the data from elsewhere and put it into a single repository in order to use it in a unified fashion, I think that's going to stop too. You know, how many copies of the Twitter fire hose do we need on this earth? We just need to be able to have access to it, right?
Yeah.
So we have the Twitter API, we have the Facebook API. We should have internal, the marketing API and the finance API and the operations API, and be able to serve up data as needed, and let people subscribe to it and get it to them however they want to consume it, whether it's directly in an application that drives the business or drives their department, or through reporting or through dashboards, or to serve up to affiliates and partners, corporate partners. I think that's all should be on the table, and someone should be ultimately responsible for doing that from a governance perspective and implementation technical perspective.
Yeah, you're right. For far too long, we've been developing applications, back-end applications that manage data, but only do so with the performance characteristics and operational features of those applications in mind, and with very little thought given to the ancillary or secondary uses of that data for analytic purposes or otherwise. And if we could start designing applications themselves that enable data to be leveraged in ways other than that application was originally intended, I think we can kind of avoid having to move data around and building ancillary data structures and so forth. And we'll get there, if not today, then then tomorrow.
Thank you, guys. And talking about APIs for partners and how they could use your data, our next question. This person asks, I've heard you talk about data monetization. I'm assuming that's you, Doug, but we'll have Joe chime in also. I've heard you talk about data monetization. Can you give some concrete examples of successful data monetization projects that you've seen? Also, can you share some tips about how to get this project off the ground as quickly as possible?
Okay, that's a long question. Let me try to condense. So first, let's talk about what data monetization is and kind of set that bar. Again, it's what we call generating economic benefits from data. So there's a variety of ways to do so. Initially, when you hear the term data monetization, you're prone to think about just selling data, and that's certainly one way to monetize data. But you can also sell reports, you can sell analyses, you can barter or trade with data in exchange for goods and services or favorable commercial terms. You can enhance existing products or services with data by baking data into them. You can even, rather than selling your data or making your data available to others, you can make others' products and services available to, say, your customers. So when organizations come to us and they say, hey, we can't monetize our customer data, we say, well, that's kind of BS. You actually can, but you have to invert the model. I can sell information about your products and services to my customers without exposing who they are externally. So we refer to that as inverted data monetization. And then, of course, there's ways internally to generate value from data by improving business process performance, reducing risks, reducing expenses, improving partner relationships, and so forth. So really, if you're looking broadly at this concept of data monetization, really any way that you're measuring that economic benefit, you could consider to be monetization. Boy, I don't know where to start. We've compiled a library of nearly 500 examples of how organizations are using data and analytics in innovative and high-value ways. I'm trying to think of some of my favorites here. There's an insurance company that, for example, that realized they were sitting on a decade of adjuster reports, and then realized by looking at them that they could identify fraud by looking for omissions and certain kinds of terms that were used and inconsistencies, and they were able to create a model, an analytic model for text mining those adjuster reports to identify fraud and dramatically increase their decrease the number of fraudulent cases and increase the pursuit of fraudulent cases to the extent of tens of millions of dollars. There are companies that have said they want to go kind of all in on data monetization and have actually spawned separate businesses. Allstate is an example of a company that got a request from the automobile industry for access to its automobile claims data for obvious reasons. We want to build better cars. We want to understand what kind of accidents people are getting in, or what kinds of the cars are getting the damage the most, and improve the safety and reduce the expense of getting car repairs. And Allstate said, listen, we're their motto is the good hands company. They say, we're the good hands company. We can't sell this data. So we suggested to them that this was a brand issue and that perhaps they ought to create a separate business to monetize their data externally, even if they had to de-identify it and aggregate it and redact it and so forth, so that actual customer data wasn't exposed. It was still considered to be a bit of a reputational issue for them. So we advised they start a separate company to do that, and that's what they've done. So if you're interested in insurance claims related data, you can check out the company called Arity. And then finally, we're working with a company in the healthcare industry to help them monetize their data more broadly. They've realized that they're sitting on really unique data when it comes to pharmaceuticals and patient data and things like that. And so they're augmenting, we're working with them to augment the value that generates both internally and then the revenue stream that they can generate from that data. When it comes to kind of the best practices, kind of get these things underway, I would suggest that companies that are successful with data monetization really have to take a real defined product management approach to this. It's not something you can kind of fool around with and say, oh, we're going to generate this report and see if we can sell it. Well, if it's not really baked into your sales and marketing process, if you really don't have defined, packaged, well-priced data products that are advertised and promoted as such, and developed to a commercial level of specification, then you're really just not going to be successful with it, and those kinds of initiatives tend to flounder. So I think a good data monetization project starts with having a good product manager, and of course sponsorship as well.
I could add a little bit to that. So while Doug was speaking, I was kind of counting. We have currently 5 projects right now. I would like to say they're all in flight, but some are stalled because of COVID-19. But the concept is still there. So there are 2 financial services, 1 healthcare, 1 insurance, and 1 automotive industry. And all of them have the same thing in common. They're all building what they're calling, maybe under different labels, but essentially a data marketplace. So they all, they went through a process with us to figure out how they can monetize their data, and then came up with some ideas. And then it turns out that just making your data readily available and easy to pick, and being able to put it into a shopping cart and have somebody buy it. That taking that metaphor and turning it into something that is tangible. That seems to be the trend that we're seeing now. What it is, what are the insights? They're all different all across the board, depending on your industry and your specialty and your data, and that's all part of the process of discovering the value. But the delivery of it is building a marketplace. And I will share, we don't have any products to push, but there's an open source tool out there called CKAN, C-K-A-N, that could be a very easy, low-cost framework. That's it's a bunch of Python libraries that you can build this shopping cart metaphor based on a data catalog for people to search your data, find your data, and purchase your data. and offer up insights. So you generate through your internal data curation, you build your data insights through your data science, you serve it up through CCAN and allow people to use it internally and purchase it externally. You can even use it internally, the shopping cart metaphor, for just chargebacks through your cost centers if no real dollars are exchanged. Let's see, what was the next part of that? Those are just some ideas. I also want to bring up a different way, not necessarily generating money, but generating goodwill, right? Especially in today's world. We have one client that is taking malpractice data and finding patterns in the data to look for trends of where different healthcare organizations are making the same mistakes. And then they're taking that data and they're sharing it with a nonprofit subsidiary that is a patient advocacy group. So what they're doing is they're taking data that's made for one purpose, basically claims processing of healthcare claims, and then they're taking it and they're using it with another subsidiary to improve people's lives. So they're looking for things like, infant mortality, staph infections, whatever it is. They come up with, they find patterns where there's a trend in the data. They look for ways that they can affect that issue through physician training, hospital policies, whatever it is, and then they go in and they help the hospitals change their process of how they're doing things to improve lives of patients. That is all through using data in ways that it wasn't originally intended by some healthcare claims processing company.
All right. Thank you, Joe. And I think we only have time left for one more question. This is more of a technical question. It's more posed to you, Joe. Data mart, data warehouse, data lake, what is the next latest and greatest architecture that we should be looking at?
As long as it's not a data quarantine, it could be called anything.
How about a data lake house? We've been hearing about the data lake house. Boy, some folks have written some scathing reviews of that concept.
No, what you call it doesn't matter. I'll be happy when we start talking about data less and trying to label it less, because that means it's just become pervasive in our everyday life. We don't talk about like what's the air that we're breathing. We just breathe it, right? Is it, so I think data should just be something that we are experiencing as part of our DNA, and where it comes from should start. If we, as whatever you want to call us, data zealots, I don't know what we are, but if we do our job right, it'll become so easy to use that you don't have to think about it anymore. And then it's just, stop using the word data and it's just information. And I think once we could get to that, then I think maybe we've had some real success.
Yeah, it's a matter of knowing what APIs exist and what's in the marketplace, and then not having to worry about what's kind of beneath the covers there. Yeah.
But I will backtrack 1 second. I do think that all of these things, a data warehouse, a data lake, a data shed, a data reservoir, whatever we want to call it, a data puddle, a data disaster, like whatever. It's all part of an ecosystem. And I don't think one replaces the other. I think they all need each other in order to breathe and nurture and grow and evolve, and make an environment where mankind can actually be improved. And I think the entire ecosystem needs all of those moving parts. Just like, stagnant water will become toxic, right? You need fish in it, you need birds over it, you need trees around it, right? You need algae, you need some things that, that you don't really consume directly, but indirectly, all those moving parts are really important. And I think that ecosystem and the metaphor of a lake, right, is very, very relevant when it comes to data as well. So I do think maybe if you need a label, building a data ecosystem in your corporate environment is probably the next thing to focus on.
Yeah, and even thinking about the extended data ecosystem among your partners and suppliers, to what degree that you're rather sharing data structures rather than exchanging data all over the place. So if you can create a shared data structure that's available to you, your partners and suppliers and maybe customers, then we don't have to have copies of data all over the place.
All right, excellent. Thank you, guys. I enjoyed hearing about data puddles and data ponds. Hopefully not data deluges or data pandemics. That's all we have for today. Everyone, thank you for attending. If you have any questions that we did not address, please email them to remy@caserta.com and I'll be sure to get you an answer. Again, thank you guys. That was very informative, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks everyone. Take care. Be well.
Yeah. Bye.